Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. We will get started in just a moment. We're going to allow folks to have just a moment to come on into the webinar room with us. And then we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion, not something that will fix itself. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Once you're settled in and you can hear us, go ahead and take a moment to let us know where you're joining us from as other folks are coming on to the call. Thank you, Lori. Nice to have you joining us from New York. We're going to get started in just a moment. We appreciate your patience. There was another webinar that was finishing right as we were about to begin. So it took just a moment for us to open up the room. Thank you. Hello, Joe from Kansas City. Nice to have you. Linda from Colorado, who will be getting the MLB game instead of Georgia this year. Interesting turn of events, huh, Linda? Nice to have you. That's all right. Oh, hello, Lori, Atlanta. Speaking of the two, right back to back. Nice to have you both. We're going to go ahead and get started. We know that some other folks are coming on. So here's the deal. Anything that we can do to make this webinar meaningful for you, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you're working on. We want to hear any questions that you may have. Oftentimes we don't have an opportunity to get to all the questions. And sometimes we don't know the answers to some of the questions. But if I don't, I hope you'll reach out and I'll be happy to have a strategy session, complimentary, of course, just to support you in your efforts, as this is a very important topic and we'll just call it culture changing experience that we're all going through. So today's webinar, I'm excited to introduce you to Lean Dei. And our topic today is about diversity and inclusion. It's not something that's going to fix itself. So how, in fact, can you use a framework and technology to drive that culture change? And so to introduce you to Lean DEI, Vivek and myself and one of our other partners, Shwetha, created Lean DEI out of a mutual passion to inspire and be a part of the shift in our society's consciousness around fairness and diversity appreciation and inclusion and equity. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Shwetha unfortunately could not join us today, and then Vivek is going to introduce himself, and then we'll move on to our agenda. So I am Anisa Aven. I am the CEO of Turnkey Coaching and Development Solutions. And I will share with you, actually, I am unable to see the chat, so I just want to make sure I can do that. 1 second. Let me switch my view here. All right, now I think I'm good. I don't want to miss questions as they come in. So thank you. So for Turnkey, we founded Turnkey in 2004 with the entire intention being to become a single source solution, scalable provider for learning and development. And over the years, and particularly since 2015, we've had more and more and more calls for diversity, equity, and inclusion training, education, coaching, and now culture shift initiatives. We have more than 1,000 coaches and expert consultants around the country and key hubs globally, and many of whom have been working in the diversity and inclusion space inside workplaces for many decades now. And so leaning on their expertise, we have pulled together some a framework and some expertise that I think you're going to be able to walk away from today. As I mentioned, Shwetha Pai couldn't join us today, but she's on our management team. She is the CEO of Org Analytics, and throughout her career, she has worked in a variety of senior finance and strategy roles. And her company, Org Analytics, is a software-enabled network analysis tool that measures unconscious bias and supports companies in benchmarking their state of inclusion in their organization. And Vivek, will you please introduce yourself?
Thanks, Anisa. Hey everyone, my name is Vivek. I'm the CEO of Weave. We help people leaders to build happy and high-performing teams. We actually created the first empathetic AI chatbot for employee engagement, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that later. In a previous life, I was a consultant for Fortune 100 companies. My job was moving from organization to organization of different industries, different sizes, and helping them solve their problems. As doing that, I started to see a trend, which was this growing disconnect between employees and leaders. For a multitude of reasons, we have a faster pace of work, we have new technologies, we've had a huge shift to remote and disconnected work. But the question became, how do we continue to build strong employee-leader relationships no matter where we are? At Weave, we use AI and natural language processing to solve that question. That aspect of what we do at Weave is what really ties together the Lean Dei framework you're going to hear about today.
Beautiful, beautiful. So let's jump right into our agenda. There we go. We're going to go there. Actually, before we begin, I want to make sure you guys know about our DEI benchmark. If you go to leandei.com/benchmark, what you're going to see there is a way for you to maybe in 10 minutes, you'll answer a bunch of questions related to your level of agreement regarding your company's D&I initiatives, what you're doing, what you're not doing, how well you're doing it, etc. And at the end of that, you're going to get a score. And that score will identify for you some potential gaps or some potential opportunities in which you'll want to put your attention upon. Now, you're also welcome at the end of that to schedule a strategy session with us, with myself or with Vivek, and sometimes both of us. We are here to support you in kind of evaluating where are we, where do we need to be, what's the best path to get there. So want to make sure you have that. And be sure to head on over there after our webinar or after today's sessions and take your benchmark. So jumping into our agenda, we're going to talk about the elements and principles of an effective DEI program. We're going to start though by giving a little bit about our landscape, why D&I is on everyone's minds right now, and what companies need to do to get ahead of the concerns related to this polarizing conversation that we're experiencing now, as more and more of us are looking to make a difference and no longer tolerating inequity in the workplace. We're going to talk about that elephant in the room, and the resistance to D&I programs and some of the myths we're going to cover. We're going to talk about how to create a right-sized solution. More than any other training and development objective, D&I requires that we are mindful of how we implement a diversity and inclusion strategy. It's really important. And so the framework that we're going to introduce you to is threefold: identify, engage, and solve. And the first being identify your organization's where are you, including the unconscious biases. Second, engage your employees. And third, solve for inclusion, solve for diversity, and eventually, even though it's a little bit more difficult, solve for equity in the workplace. So Vivek, will you share with us a little bit about what's happening, that social disruption that we're all seeing, and give us some context for why it matters?
Mm-hmm. So as we all know, the world is changing. Social disruption is happening. DE&I issues are now C-level issues, but it continues to challenge most companies. At this point, our options are to try and keep up. We can get run over, or we can actually drive the change. At this point, everyone knows the stats. Inclusive organizations are more innovative, they have greater returns, lower turnover, they have more market share than their peers. But still, we see companies struggle. Where we're seeing microaggressions at Bon Appetit, racial discrimination at Facebook, age discrimination at WeWork, lawsuits against Google, Twitter, Nike, Goldman Sachs from women in pursuit of the C-suite. And a very representative example actually is Starbucks. Starbucks in 2018 had a very public incident where a manager called the police on two Black men who were just going and grabbing coffee. They were arrested within 10 minutes of them just sitting at a table. In response, Starbucks very publicly closed down all 8,000 stores to do trainings. But now you fast forward and come back to 2020, they're banning employees for wearing BLM attire. They're coming back into the headlines for discrimination kinds of issues. So the lesson we can take from this is that they're being very reactive, despite taking the issue quite seriously, despite pouring in impressive resources into unconscious bias trainings. The culture itself is slow to change. So if the company's aware of the benefits of being inclusive and diverse and being well aware of the costs of not doing so, what is the gap? What are they missing? By and large, diversity and inclusion initiatives are structurally flawed. They tend to be one-off, check-the-box kind of programs that are not tied to company strategy. They're often just virtue signaling, and they target only the currently growing minority demographic. They tend to be very top-down and overly centralized initiatives that don't actually propagate down to the day-to-day reality of an employee. By virtue of that, they tend to be very generic and one-size-fits-all kinds of trainings or coachings that don't actually result in real change. And they end up being misaligned to the real issues. They don't support the operational leaders that actually have the most impact on the day-to-day of an employee. And because of all this, there is no measurable ROI beyond surface level diversity stats. When there's no ROI, it's very difficult to justify long-term programs, and you end up having no long-term impact. Now, in addition to diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions being disparate, being structurally flawed, there are pretty complex social forces at play. Not all discrimination is obvious, and not all solutions are going to be effective. So Anisa is going to talk about what this means for our programs.
So what does this mean? And by our programs, while we are going to introduce you to the Lean DEI framework of identify, engage, and solve, what we're hoping that you'll take away from this is how to use that framework internally to structure every single initiative that you may bring forward. So what we know, right, is that training, when done alone, can be divisive. We know that coaching can be expensive and unpredictable. And most organizations aren't going to invest in coaching across the organization. We know that awareness alone fails to inspire diversity appreciation. So education alone, training alone, coaching alone, diversity policies are required. You're going to want to look into your employee handbook and your hiring practices and your harassment policies and really evaluate, are these well-written and inclusive, and really address the concerns of our workforce. But in isolation, it won't be enough. And part of that is because resistance is truly predictable right now. We know that we're at a tipping point. And whether a person understands what systemic racism actually is, or structural discrimination or not, it exists. And because of that, there is an escalation in how we are responding to acts of exclusion. And this is on the extreme. An extreme implies a negative connotation, and I don't mean that. On one side of the pendulum, we're seeing quote unquote cancel culture, right? And on the other side, we're seeing a resistance to cancel culture, when in fact, all social change has always been about standing up and, or better said, sitting at the lunch counter and saying, I'm no longer going to be pushed out. I am equal. I have a right to eat here. That is the same type of action that cancel culture is. So what we're seeing, though, is this well-formed storm of organizational crisis, and the training that you are going to bring to your organization just have to be prepared that there's going to be division and difficult conversations around that. So let's talk a little bit about how to lower this resistance. What we know, and psychology tells us this, is that knowing why there will be resistance means we can design our programs in a way to be effective while minimizing the threat to one's social identity, right? And right now, we're seeing so many of us identify with our political affiliations or our values associated with our religious beliefs. And that core social identity is not something that we're going to be able to address head on in our D&I programs and expect people to open up to where this is going to head. So what does that mean? So social identity, as popularized by the 1986 research by Teifel and Turner, proposed that the groups which people belong to were an important source of pride and self-esteem, right? And so as an automatic response, group members experience a social identity crisis or threat when the moral behavior of their group is called into question, right? So let me give you an example of this. So let's take, for example, there's this myth that white men cannot be subject to discrimination or marginalization. Well, when a white male who is defensive about this whole D&I effort, it is going to be better to talk about our common interests, the value of diversity, how to acknowledge that no one, male, female, BIPOC, someone of a different, uh, all the generational differences, ageism. There's no one, none of us that are excluded from that experience of discrimination, or having to defend who we are in our social identities. So part of what you're going to want to do to extinguish that fuse of resistance is to start focusing on that progress that we've made and how we all really do at the core of our being want life to be fair. We want our workplace to be fair. We want people to earn, right, promotions, not just be granted promotions. And in fact, the D&I efforts will in fact be movement towards ensuring that across all differences. So you're going to want to take your focus and make sure that you're focusing on the value of diversity, how diverse organizations outperform their peers systematically. I mean, there's evidence about that across the board. You're going to want to look at the behaviors of inclusion versus the behaviors of exclusion. Um, we really want to create a safe place. On the screen, you see there that we talk a little bit about the elimination of public shaming. It's really important that all voices have an opportunity to be heard. And Vivek is going to show you a technology-driven way here shortly to make sure that we create safe places for employees to be heard. We also want to make sure that in these educational opportunities, that it's a safe place, that we recognize as a company, we're going to get this wrong. We're not going to get it right, but we're looking for our community, and we're looking for ways in which we can live our values more fully through the journey of awareness as an organization, as a workforce, as peers, as managers, as co-workers, etc. You're also going to want to start focusing on the benefits of equality for all. When certain sectors of our society begin vocalizing, take for example, in society, the example of men not being awarded shared custody until the last few decades. There is more and more men that are awarded custody, or bare minimum awarded shared custody in divorces, whereas for many years that wasn't the case. What created that shift? Greater awareness in society that men are equally qualified as parents as women, and unless there is some compelling reason for the justification to award one gender over another, then that shouldn't be the case. Well, how did we get there? We got there by looking towards equality for all, and by the minority, or that group that was marginalized, coming together to voice how are we going to make a change. These are conversations that, although not work related, healthy D&I programs will have to address. And how are you going to do that? You're going to do that by listening, whether that's creating listening circles, or D&I surveys, or pulse surveys, or, for example, leveraging some of the technology we're going to show you here in a moment. The last little piece I want to say is a component of the program will need to include the historical injustices, or the ways in which we need to educate ourselves about marginalization of different segments, without going too deep in that. I'm not using my language well. Too many historical injustices, although it must be a part of your program. If you're wanting to extinguish the threat, or minimize the threat to one's social identity, we cannot have our programs be so focused on historical injustices that you have a large percentage of your workforce feeling like they can't speak up because they are now in the minority. So we want you to drip that over time in order to be more effective. And that, of course, is the elephant in the room. A dominant focus on the historical injustices will cause your majority groups to resist, deny, and withdraw support for your D&I goals. And your minority groups will be exhausted. And so that's how you can get buy-in across the organization. It's just by being mindful of the process of which you need to go through to lower DEI defensiveness and avoid derailing your programs. So that brings us to why Vivek and Shwetha and I created Lean DEI. Lean DEI is an end-to-end solution for building an inclusive workplace. The whole purpose is to enable diverse hiring, team building, and decision making at all levels of an organization. It starts with, it's the framework that I mentioned earlier. It's all about continuous cultural transformation in bite-sized ways in order to shift the culture over time without disrupting work. So driven by cutting edge AI and world-class technology, you're going to go through 3 phases in your own programs. Lean DEI in particular makes it easy, but the 3 phases are identify. You first want to identify, using some type of a network analysis, the unconscious biases, the employees who are impacted, and the key people leaders, those champions who are already in the conversation and have a healthy, positive reputation for being good listeners and good champions of change who can make a difference. That's the first goal, identify. Second goal is we want to engage folks. With Lean DEI, Kim, our empathetic AI chatbot, is an always available resource for employees to voice their needs in a safe, confidential, and non-disruptive manner. Kim intelligently, and we'll show you this in a minute, deep dives to actionable issues and escalates them to people leaders. And finally, you're going to have to solve, right? So your people leaders and your managers of managers need to have access, I should say, to expert D&I consultants for education, training, micro consulting, employee relations issues, and coaching. So enabling those champions as well as your managers to take the right actions and make the right decisions at the right time will shift your D&I initiatives towards the progress you're really looking to make. So Vivek, will you introduce us to identify and engage?
Sure. Thanks, Nisa. This is how we typically view our organizations, by their hierarchy, by their org chart. The problem with this view is that it doesn't really reflect the complex relationships that are really driving an organization. The reality is that your organization is filled with complex social relationships, mentors, collaborators, sponsors, problem solvers, decision makers, and all of those relationships flex and adapt in order to solve organizational problems. Now with Lean Dei, we use organizational network analysis to get visibility into these traditionally hidden relationships. By gathering relationship data across key diversity, equity, inclusion dimensions, we can essentially understand how your organization's employees interact for trust issues, social issues, mentorship scenarios, etc. That breadth of relationship data is then given depth by creating network maps at your team, division, and company levels, which we cross-reference against employee demographic data. Finally, we use a suite of machine learning-based analytics tools to help us make very targeted and data-driven decisions. So I know I threw a lot of jargon, so let's take a look at what this actually looks like. So we're seeing here an example of a real organizational network map where network relationships are mapped on this graph. The bigger dots or nodes are your key influencers or champions within your organization. The lines represent the number of relationships or connections that they have. And you can see that these relationships are mapped across various dimensions that you see on the top of the screen here. There's knowledge, career, mentorship, social, etc. And we can see the individual influence and inclusion across these dimensions. When you zoom out, you see the group inclusion and influence across the entire organization. Now, these disparate kind of clusters that we see are leading indicators for access problems, silos in your teams, fringe employees, people who are at risk. For example, this network analysis could show us that our West Coast Black female engineers have very few career or mentorship relationships. They're all going to a single person in order to get that kind of support. This kind of network clog would tell us that the employee group is facing some kind of unconscious bias and that we need to be able to dive in deeper. So at this point, we have a pretty decent idea of the employees who are impacted by diversity and inclusion issues. We have a high-level view on the biases that are present in the organization and what kind of dimensions they map under. And we know the key champions who are best positioned to drive change and take action. Now that we know all of that, it is time to engage. Now, engagement means conversation. It means communicating with your employees, having conversation to understand the issues that they're facing and taking the steps and actions to resolve those issues. It is very easy to have those conversations at small single-digit companies, but how do we have these conversations at scale with our distributed workforces? And most importantly, how do we make this conversation not a one-off event, but a continuous process? And that's where I want you to meet Kim. Kim is an always available chatbot that has organic conversation with employees to understand their issues and needs. She lives on your messaging channel like a Microsoft Teams, Slack, even email or SMS, and communicating with her feels like DMing with a coworker. Now, Kim's got this very interesting combination of anonymity plus empathy, which creates a perfect space for very candid feedback. And that's because employees feel that they're not being judged, that they're able to talk very transparently and openly with confidence. Now, there are two ways that employees can chat with Kim, and whether or not you use Lean Dei, we recommend that these are two key communication pipelines that you have for your employees. The first is anytime they need to escalate an issue, Kim is available 24/7. They can reach out and that issue will be direct to the right person. Second, and more frequently, you're going to want to proactively reach out to your employees and talk to them about DE&I issues in the workplace. Now, at small organizations, you can have those conversations in person on a regular basis. For those of you in larger organizations, Kim can help you have the conversation at scale. But the question becomes, how do we know which conversations to have? what use cases to cover, and with which employees. And that's where the network analysis comes in. The network analysis tells us which conversations we need to be having and with who. Take my example from before. If I know that my Black engineers on the West Coast are on the periphery, that they're not connected to influential decision makers or career mentors, Kim can engage with those employees, understand what's happening on the ground, what their immediate needs are, and how to address them. To preface, these conversations are not reactive. We're obviously not going in and asking, hey, are you facing discrimination? Instead, we're focusing on the underlying issues and on resolving those issues before they escalate into expanded and very public incidents. So I want to take a minute and actually show you what an example of one of these conversations looks like. So I'm going to jump into a demo conversation with Kim. Here, Kim is integrated into our web chat. She's reaching out to me as an employee to understand my thoughts on inclusion and mentorship at my company. So I'm going to jump into this conversation. The first question that Kim has for me is, do I feel like I'm included in the decisions that impact my work? I'm going to say, no, I feel like my ideas are ignored. And all my misspellings and grammatical errors and all that get cleaned up by Kim in the back end. She's also using some natural language analysis to understand where to dive in and what the right follow-up questions are for this conversation. Here, she wants to know, is this a trend that I'm experiencing at the workplace? I'm going to say, yeah, some of us need to keep improving ourselves. Some have it too easy. Now, in addition to natural language analysis, she's also using a couple of forms of emotional and sentiment analysis. In this case, to empathize with me, let me know that it's an area that the company is focusing on and that my thoughts are going to be passed along anonymously. Now, the follow-up question that makes sense is, what are some of these ideas that I feel are being ignored that I wish my leadership would consider? This is a mechanism that Kim has to actually crowdsource suggestions for improvement and engage employees in solution building for issues. So I'm going to say, it'd be nice if our sales follow-ups were automated. We could spend more time with clients. Now, this is an issue that will be, or this is a recommendation that will be sent straight to my manager, kind of kicking off an action planning flow for them. And more importantly, if and when any suggestions by me or my peers are acted upon, Kim has a mechanism to broadcast that back to employees saying, hey, we heard what you said. We took into account your recommendations, your voice, and this is what's happening as a result of it. Ultimately, what that does is create a two-way dialogue, a relationship where employees know that if they interact with Kim, they're going to see tangible and rapid improvement to their issues. Finally, Kim is checking in if there's anyone in management or leadership that advocates for me. I'm going to say, no, my manager sometimes, but he usually doesn't have time. Now, in this case, what Kim is able to do is actually integrate with your existing initiatives and resources that are available at your company. In this case, I'm reporting that I don't really have the mentorship network that I need. It turns out that the company has a mentorship program that they've already invested in, and now Kim is able to direct me to that resource at the right time. The last thing that I want to show you here is, what do I do in cases where someone is talking about something I don't want a chatbot to handle, where I want a human to be able to see it as quickly as possible? So if I was to say something like, I'm being bullied, there's a harassment issue in the workplace, there's some other kind of thing going on where we need a human's eye very quickly, those are things Kim is going to be able to flag for and immediately escalate up for someone to reach out to me directly. And I see that we have a question here in the chat. What if my employees don't take the software seriously? Is there a way to moderate that? That is a a very good question. So let me show you an example here. We get a lot of people that like to kind of mess around with Kim, especially in the early days. So things like a joke or a question that you get more often than you would imagine is, will you marry me? So Kim is able to kind of understand these kinds of small talk scenarios in a Siri or kind of Google Assistant type way and have basic kinds of chats before driving people back to what she's actually trying to do. So usually people will play around for a little bit and then they'll kind of get back on track. But more importantly is the relationship that you're building with the process, not just Kim's interactions. And for that, I'm going to jump back into the deck here.
Before you move on to that too, Vivek, will you also share in the studies that you've done, you have found that the level of engagement with Kim is actually better than, say, year-over-year engagement surveys or pulse surveys. And there's a certain, I'm not going to say that the statistic because I'll get it wrong, related to engagement, but also in issue to action resolution.
Yep, that's absolutely right. So we're typically seeing if it's an organization that has low to mid survey response rates, we can oftentimes double that. If it's an organization that's already got pretty high rates, we're usually going to maintain those high rates, but then also get much deeper data quality because we're asking the right kinds of follow-up questions. Now, a really key point is that we do surface a lot of really fantastic insights and data around employee emotion, sentiment, what are the issues that are important, dynamic topic analysis to kind of pull out the areas you need to focus. But really, the key thing is that you're building a path to improvement. So this is a pipeline which starts with having conversations with employees to understand their needs, broadcasting back to say, hey, we heard you, and this is what we're doing about your issues. Or to say, hey, we heard you and we need help to understand what to do about it. And we're crowdsourcing, we're engaging you in the discussion to try and understand our next steps and kicking off the action planning. Finally, this is not a one and done kind of process. The conversation is continuous and you ensure that the needle is incrementally but consistently moving. What we see here, to come back around to the question that was asked, is as you build this very robust process and pipeline, you build a relationship where employees feel that if they engage in this process, their issues are going to be solved in a timely manner. And leaders should feel that if they engage, they're going to know, they're never going to have to ask what's next. They're always going to know what action to take when moving from identification to resolution of an issue. Now, whether or not you use Lean DEI, this is a process that we highly recommend you implement at your organizations. That said, for organizations that do utilize KIM, we tend to see about an 18x improvement in issue to resolution timelines. Now, at this point, we have talked to employees who are impacted by D&I issues about the biases that they are facing. And we're going to deliver those insights to the key champions that are able to drive change at an organization. And remember, those are people that we've been able to identify as influencers across specific areas in your organization via a network analysis. Now that we've built this very robust process, how do we ensure that the people leaders are actually able to make the right decisions, and that they're able to take the right actions? And for that, I'm going to pass it over to Anisa.
Thank you, Vivek. So let's start with just a breakdown, right, of the elements of a comprehensive education as well as diversity, equity, inclusion initiative / program, right? So the best practice is to fully leverage your programs at the right time with the right people, those champions of change that we mentioned earlier, with just a right-sized approach in an ongoing and iterative fashion. And if you were on the session with us earlier this morning, then you've heard me talk a little bit about some of these. But to high level it, first and foremost, create some type of a mentoring program, paying close attention to the need for top-down sponsorship and diversity across age, sexual orientation, race, religion, gender, and other identities. The second is you're going to want to establish and reevaluate yearly a diversity focused recruiting plan, including the use of hiring technology to increase fairness. Most of us have heard about the very real statistics that if a resume comes in that has an ethnic sounding name, that candidate is 2 times less likely to be called in for an interview. And if they get the interview, they're 2 times less likely to get another interview. And the only thing that changes from those elements is in that study was the name. So you want to do things like blind resume audits when you're looking to hire and meet your diversity goals. And you want to train your managers and your hiring managers to understand the value of this. You want to be able to facilitate awareness and buy-in via implicit bias or unconscious bias training. You want to review and fine tune your discrimination and harassment policies and ensure that the language from everything from a job application to benefits application, that those forms use inclusive language as opposed to less inclusive or exclusive language. You want to be able to inspect and improve your complaint systems. Yes, confidentiality is key, as Kim just demonstrated a few minutes ago, but having the ability to dive a little bit deeper is really important. And so setting up a methodology for anonymous, easy submission of key data that you need inside your organization to measure your results is important. What else? Where am I? There, foster diversified business networks and cross-company networking by established employee resource groups. You want to be able to appoint a diversity and inclusion council, and ideally some champions of change to support all of your initiatives. And you want to educate them on how to communicate the goals and how to articulate and foster buy-in within their groups and within their influence networks around the programs. It's really essential that you create a safe space for race and diversity conversations. And when a company messes up, so to speak, does something that was clueless or, even openly the wrong choice, that management has the humility and the courage to own it, to address it, to have conversations with those in the workplace that are impacted by their decisions and their commitment to move forward in a different manner. And to do that takes time, but it also takes the probably the foundational importance is creating that safe place. It's also really important that you have top-down support for D&I resolutions and values. And one of the best ways to do that is to take your executive team through a DEI strategy session, looking at the current mission, vision, values, and guiding principles, and taking a lens and saying, is our mission inclusive or exclusive? Do we need to take another look at it and see if there are ways in which we can revise our mission, our vision, our values, our guiding principles in such a way as to where we can take ownership from the top down in shifting our culture to have greater respect for differences. A lot of executive teams will verbally say they buy in, but they don't necessarily understand how it's going to play out. They're very focused on the strategy, right, and the implementation of new innovation, et cetera. And so HR will want to get them involved by talking their language, and that's around the business case for diversity, equity, inclusion, and the strategy for how they can adapt their current principles in a way that supports the organization. And finally, we've talked about this, committing to continuous improvement. There's never going to be a time where an organization doesn't need to look at what's occurred, look at how they can improve, and continue to grow and improve. It is never ending. Even with some of the organizations, when you take that DEI benchmark, we've had some organizations that were like, oh my gosh, they scored an 85. They're off the chain, right? And so I get on the phone having a strategy session. I'm like, okay, here's the truth. Your organization is really progressive in your D&I initiatives. What is it that I can support you with? And we get into it. And what we're realizing is, well, we haven't found a way to scale our listening, right? So maybe we need to do some more listening sessions, or it's been 4 years since we actually did a focus group to find out, are there areas in which we haven't addressed yet, right? So there's always going to be, at least for the next, multiple decades, opportunities for improvement here. So knowing that going into it, and sharing that with your managers and sharing that with the executive team, so that this is about a culture shift, and at bare minimum, cultures take somewhere between 18 and 2 years to shift, is going to be really important when you're making the business case for what you want to bring to the organization. So let's look a little bit deeper. And thank you, Paige, for sending out the benchmark quiz. Let's look a little bit deeper into this concept around right-sized solution. Earlier, we talked about the resistance to D&I, right? Which is why organizations that are creating massive change inside their organization, because they are super fired up about it. I love it. I wish that all organizations could do that, but I also wish that employees could embrace that kind of large scale change in the organization. But not all workplaces have the appetite for that. Not only do not all leadership teams have the appetite, nor do all employees. And so what you don't want to have happen is to have mass discomfort without the resources to deal with that discomfort, and then drive employees who would otherwise come along with you for the journey out the door. And so to do that, you're going to want to create a bite-sized approach over an 18-month to 2-year timeline, right? And you're going to do this by those mentoring programs. You're going to want to create a train the trainer. And what I mean by that is get an expert to come in and support you and your HR department, and then your key champions, with the right communication and the right values and the guiding principles to recognize what's the performance and the behaviors that map with our values, or these guiding principles. Which competencies do we want to start working on? Empathy, compassion, understanding, awareness, how to be an anti-racist, for example. It's really one of the best things you can do is facilitated discussion circles or listening circles, just conversations in a safe place facilitated by an expert to allow people to vocalize their truth and hear what other people go through as well. Micro consulting. The reason I say that is a lot of folks will hire a large consulting firm, or engage a big consulting project just to make over everything. And that's great, but it's not always necessary or needed, right? And so what I would encourage you to do is look for ways to create a micro consulting relationship. Hey, we've got an issue here around a manager who's been accused of wrongful termination. We need some support in that, right? How about just a right-sized solution for that, as opposed to a complete overhaul? And sometimes you need a complete overhaul. But because we know you're going to want to stretch your D&I budget out, it's important that you pick and choose and just do that minimum effective dose. The same for coaching, right? And here shortly, we're going to talk a little bit about how to scale coaching using technology so that you can provide all of your people managers, and then ultimately using Kim, all of your people with the solution, access to the solutions they need through that dialogue. And then finally, right training at the right time over a longer period of time to cultivate that shift. So if we look at how we want to support you, the framework is identify, engage, and solve, right? First, We've identified where are the unconscious biases, who are the people that are impacted, and who are your champions of change. How can we enroll them into the initiative? Second, you want to engage. What are the folks on the ground experiencing? What do we need to address? We addressed it. Do they feel that we addressed it or not? What resources are people not aware of that we have that we can make sure is at their fingertips when they need it? And finally, solve. So during the identify and engage process, you're going to find out where are our unconscious biases, which divisions have managers who are who play favorites, who others say are racist or are just clueless about why diversity matters, or they're only hiring people that are just like them, for example, right? And this goes across the spectrum for all races and all orientations and all ages, right? We as human beings are built in such a way as to where we like people that are like us. And that's part of that unconscious bias. So it's going to be important that that's where the solving comes in. So you're going to want to have an employee relations consultant that can help you when you need it around harassment, bullying, and wrongful termination accusations, right? You're going to want to have coaching that can support those people managers with the communication skills, the empathy skills, and the knowledge of what discrimination looks like and how we can be more inclusive and what it looks like to hire for expertise and performance and diversity simultaneously. All of this equates to a change management approach that will shift the culture in a matter of a shorter amount of time than traditional DEI initiatives, for example. So what have we done? This means we have listened to our employees who are most impacted by D&I issues. We have identified and increased awareness on the biases that are present in the organization. And now we've provided targeted development for those people leaders, empowering them to take the right actions and make the right decisions at the right time. So just to recap, our Lean DEI methodology, the framework, is what we're hoping that you will take away and use in your own organization. Identify, engage, and solve with an iterative, continuous cultural transformation using change management principles all along the way. And, one thing I did want to mention about when we pulled this together, some of our clients, we have worked with Fortune 50 companies all the way down to mid-size and smaller organizations. And we've tested these individual principles and we'll call it components with many organizations across every industry that you can imagine. And so we're coming at this from a deep experience, but also knowing what works and what doesn't work around cultivating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. So it looks like, Vivek, we have another question. What's the first step for a company like mine that has no diversity programs in place? What would you say the first step is, Vivek?
Establishing a DEI council.
Yeah, and why? Why do they need a D&I council?
You need internal advocates that are thinking about this as an initiative and not a something that comes up every once in a while. Agreed. So you're regularly meeting with a group of people who not only are passionate and dedicated on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but have the formal means to affect change in an organization. So ideally, you want your committee to have people that are mid-level managers up to executives that can help you in driving real initiative.
Yeah, I think that that's really essential. So, and right on the money. And then I would say the second thing is to just do a benchmark. As you are building consensus and buy-in for making DEI I can still see your screen. You're changing some things.
Yep, just adding,
it's all good. It's all
the
good.
Benchmark link.
Yeah, the next piece is benchmarking, right? And so identifying where do we have an issue? And so you're going to want to take your demographical data, you can pull that right out of your HRIS and just look, do we have representation across our organization that actually matches the communities that we serve and the community in which we are working? And if it doesn't, I don't remember the exact number, but I think, for example, whites are 63%, something in that number. Blacks are 13%. So if you just take that number, and if your organization and the communities you serve have a certain pie chart, you want to make sure that your workforce is reflective of that pie chart. And if it's not, we have to look and see, well, what's the reason for that? And how can we change that? And that would be part of that benchmarking process. The second piece is, what's the temperature inside our organization? How are people feeling? And what do we need to address? What do we not know about our own unconscious biases as a culture that we need to hear from employees who are experiencing how we show up as a company every day? Well, I know that we are coming to the top of the hour. We are so grateful that you shared this time with us. We hope that you found it valuable. If you would, type into the chat just one takeaway from your time with us today. What's one thing that it caused you to think, or one thing that you're like, okay, I know what I want to do, or this is something that I learned that I want to take back to my organization? All right, we've got people typing things in, I see. And as we're coming up to the end of the hour, make sure you write down this benchmark link. It's leandei.com/DEI benchmark. All right. Appreciate all of your feedback there, folks. And thank you for joining us. And we'll see you again next time. Reach out and let us know how we may support you. Thank you, Vivek.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.